But he had just performed other miracles. He just had healed a deaf and mute man. They knew he was healing people. They themselves had healed people. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How could they forget? But it doesn't take long. It doesn't take long for any of us to lose sight. To experience a miracle, God working, and then to just a short time later question God. Say, how can you let this happen to me? God would look down and say, I just helped you. I gave you a miracle, and now you're just asking for more? Now you're asking where I'm at? Now you're questioning whether I can do this? This is less people. If Jesus could do it for 5,000, surely he could do it for 4,000. Jesus skipped the argument this time. He said, okay, we've already talked about this. How many loaves do you have? Jesus said, 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And they did so. He started with the bread. He broke the bread, gave everybody the opportunity to eat, to begin to have their fill. And just like in a meal, he then, with a few small fish, we don't know if it was 2, we don't know if it was a can of sardines, we don't know what it was. We just know that he threw some fish into the mix. That was the second course. They got to have their bread, then they get to have their fish. So he blesses that as well. He gave thanks to them also and told the disciples to strip it down. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present. And having sent them away, he got into the boat with the disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. He provided for them. For the second time that we know of, the disciples saw Jesus provide for thousands of people. And you know this isn't a case where Jesus just did it to show off. This was a case where thousands of people had followed him into the wilderness. Thousands of people were hungry, and he couldn't let them go in their state. He didn't do it to comfort with them. He didn't do it. Remember, in the previous chapter, in a couple chapters ago, he didn't even want to see people. He was on a retreat. He was trying to take a break. He wasn't trying to show off, but he had compassion. He cared for them. He provided for a need. We notice something as you go along with each of these miracles. It's not something where Jesus just says, here, I'm going to heal you to show off. Here, I'm going to give you food to show off. No. When somebody in faith comes to him and asks to be healed, in faith, notice the thing that Jesus keeps saying is, your faith has made you well. That's why he couldn't heal or do any miracles in his hometown, because he didn't have any faith. Because they didn't believe. These people who weren't Jews, who didn't know the background of what being a Jew was about, they had this faith. They knew. And there's a distinct possibility, of course, that they didn't know what was going on. They just simply knew that somewhere Jesus ran out and got some bread and gave it to them. And they were able to eat. Amongst the 13,000 people there, there's a good chance that 10,000 of them didn't even know that they were eating from 7 loaves of bread. That God multiplied that. And God still does that today when it's necessary. There were times at Shepherd's Heart in Pittsburgh where there just didn't seem to be enough food. But everybody, all 150 people would come through the line, and there was food to send home. It made no sense. You saw how much food was there. You saw how much there was to give. But yet God continued to provide as it was given out. God is a God of miracles even to this day. God provides for our needs. This isn't a case where we prepare for a meal and we just decide God will provide, so I'm going to buy one hamburger and we'll feed everybody. That would be showing off. This is a case where God had a group of people come together, where these people were longing to learn at the foot of Jesus and eating of that sustenance, feeding their spirit, getting ready for the day, that they would be able to know what the truth is that they've heard. And Jesus saw in the compassion on the crowd. He cared about them enough to give them what they needed, to give them the energy they needed to go home and to tell others about them. Through these people, through these 12,000 people, many people in the Gentile world and many people in the world at large were able to learn about who Jesus was. And only a few years later, they learned about the great hope that comes only through him. The disciples, walking along with Jesus every step of the way. One of the things that Mark continually points out is how clueless the disciples can be. They had just experienced all these miracles. They had just done miracles on their own. And they come to the place where they still say, once again, where do you want us to get the food from? How can we do this? And Jesus, of course, just shakes his head and says, I will provide. The key thing here is not that Jesus hands it out to each person, so it's Jesus that is doing it. Jesus gives the food to the disciples. Even when they don't know how it's working, they still do it. Even when they don't know how God is providing, they do it. Even when they themselves don't understand or have that faith that it's going to work, they listen and they obey. And that's God's call for us as well. Even when we don't understand. Even when we just don't get it. Even when we seem like we're at the bottom of our class, God's going to use us. Even when we just don't get it, God's going to use us. And God's going to ask us to serve. He asked his disciples, and through them, the gospel is proclaimed to the whole world. They're people just like us. This is just a case to let us know that they weren't anything that special. And that if there's any time that we think that we're inferior and we're not good enough, all you got to do is look at Mark chapter 8 and know that God can use us as well. That we can let people know this hope is in Jesus and that he has compassion. Would we desire to learn and to sit at his feet? Amen.